now the moderator of the next session. We plan this city on walk and roll. Doesn't that make you want to sing, right? We plan this city. Carlos Cruz-Casas, who is the Assistant Director for Strategic Planning for the Miami-Dade County's Department of Transportation and Public Works. His primary focus is to introduce mobility innovations and plan for a fully integrated mobility ecosystem. His career includes both public and private sector experience in the implementation of pedestrian, bicycle, transit, and traffic projects. As a professional engineer dedicated to the development of livable transportation, Carlos seeks to achieve the right balance between livability and mobility. And you all are so lucky to have Carlos. I know if you get outside of kind of the Miami-Dade, South Florida region, Carlos is really known as a thought leader on smart cities and innovation and mobility. I've got to meet him in cities across the country. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Carlos. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emiko, for your leadership and support. I must say that working with you and with your team for the last couple of years has been a fulfilling journey. And to everyone, good morning. Good morning. What an amazing day we have here today. We have planned a Safe Streets Summit. And I say safe, it's not safer. It's just an absolutely safe streets summit. And whether you came here in 4 wheels, 2 wheels, or your own 2 feet, this day is for you. As I was listening to Darcy this morning, I couldn't help but to think that not everything in our lives is just fast-paced, right? We need to start accelerating the deployment of better streetscape in our streets and start slowing down those moving vehicles. Let's slow down and enjoy the ride. And this panel that is coming in front of you today, right now, is going to excel on this portion. And of course, I'm a little biased since I'm standing here. And I got a little sneak peek into the presentations. This panel is going to rock. You will see that. It's going to talk about building a city, but design it by mobility for all. A city that we want to live in, a city that we want our kids to live in, and a city we want to be happy in it. Order of business, I'm going to introduce all of them at the same time, so that way we don't lose minutes in between presentations. So that means that let's use Slido to make sure that Kyle gets his questions in, otherwise you forget about what he said, right? Because there's going to be a lot going on. And we don't want to lose time because I know we can be here talking all day, especially with Ashley, listening to all the stuff she had to say. So let's start. Kyle Wagenshutz, he's the director of local innovation at the PeopleForBikes. He brings a solid history in diversity in his career. He spent more than a decade in advocating for better biking in Memphis, Tennessee, as a director of a local community bike shop, as the vice president of Bike Walk Tennessee, and as the first bicycle and pedestrian program manager for the city. This is great. In 2015, he was recognized by the Obama administration as a champion of change in his work in Memphis and Tennessee and honored at the White House ceremony. Kyle joined the PeopleForBikes in 2016 and quickly building connect great places to ride. Ashley Han, she's a co-founder of Cityfi, advising all sectors on the future of mobility in a rapidly changing world, including our team here at the Miami-Dade Department of Transportation and Public Works, but I'm going to perhaps let Ashley talk a little bit more about that later. She basically worked at the LA DOT Transportation Technology Strategy, where she authored the Urban Mobility in Digital Age, a strategy that defines public policy, organizational change, and a pilot initiative to enable cities to shape the vision of the future that works for all in an era of shared mobility and autonomous vehicles. That is a must-read, guys. I tell you, it will bring you transportation happiness at first sight. And then Paul White, last but not least, he's the Director of Safety and Policy and Advocacy at BIRD, where he works with cities to reduce transportation congestion, carbon emissions, and providing people a safe option to cars. If you're not familiar with BIRD, those are the stand-up scooters that you have been rolling in the city of Coral Gables for a few months now. Scooters that take people around, let's not forget about that. Scooters that are actually filling in a gap in our mobility needs. Prior to that, he She's been working for 7 years. From 2004 to 2018, Paul was the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives. And prior to that, he worked for 7 years. Paul, you've been around for a little while now, right? So as a Projects Director for the Institute of Transportation Development and Policy. So let's begin. Now I want all of you to enjoy the conversation today, to think what we can collectively do to get our cities ready for the challenges of today and challenges of tomorrow. Join me in a warm South Florida welcome to our panelists. Let's walk and roll, guys. Thank you.
Good morning. Two things happen when you travel from the West Coast to the East Coast. One is when you arrive, and Darcy will appreciate this, when you arrive, you feel like a superhero because you're 2 hours behind everybody here. So it's 10 o'clock, but really when you just woke up, it's only 8 o'clock for you, and you feel like you could party all night long. The second thing that happens is you wake up the next morning, and that's terrible. It is like the worst. Your alarm goes off and you say to yourself, I know I didn't get a full night's sleep. What has happened? Fortunately, and thanks to everybody here at the Intercontinental, the coffee was hot, it was plentiful, and I'm feeling good this morning. So thanks, Darcy, for kicking us off, and I know the struggle that you had this morning getting up and moving into this. So I'm Kyle, I'm with PeopleForBikes. We are based in Boulder, Colorado, but work across the country and a little bit in Canada, helping to make bicycle riding better for everybody. One of the things that I often have to do, however, is sometimes, sort of put a qualifier out there that while our name is People for Bikes, that can sometimes pigeonhole us into a very sort of specific niche of transportation. We're actually working where people for walking, we're people for scooters, we're people for getting better access to public transportation. We're essentially how people want to move around. We represent those interests so long as you don't want to drive by yourself in a car. And I think that's a really important note, to sort of think about when we're transforming our cities, we're not sort of identified by the single mode of transportation that we're actually using. And that's a lot of our work, and I spend a lot of time trying to justify our name. It's just what it is. I want to start off with the premise today, though. It's taking too long to change the way our streets work for people. Thank you. I spent about 15 years ago, I began working in bicycle advocacy. I was living in Memphis, Tennessee. I was helping run a community bicycle program, helping repair bicycles. Over the span of several years, we thought to ourselves, myself and the other leaders, we've put out like 1,000 bicycles back out on the streets of Memphis. And when we go outside of our bicycle shop, I don't see thousands of people riding bikes. Like, what's going on? That's how I got involved in bike advocacy. I came to realize that it wasn't just about having access to a vehicle. It wasn't just about having knowledge about how to repair that vehicle and how to move around. But our streets, the built environment, right in front of our bike shop wasn't conducive to bicycling. It was terrible, it was dangerous, and I began advocating for projects. I just got an email recently that one of the projects that I began advocating for in 2009 is getting ready to be constructed this spring. 10 years later. 10 years of advocacy. And this is a project that I worked on both when I was an advocate, when I got hired by the city of Memphis to run their bicycle program. I ushered it through council and funding and NEPA and all of the different processes. And 10 years later, they're just now getting ready to break ground on it. I jokingly wrote back that I would believe it when I see it, invite me when it's open. But we did a little highly scientific study of how quick it takes to change the streets in America. And you'll see it's one of the slowest moving things in our society. There are whole generations of kids that are graduating high school today that are still waiting for the streets to get changed. It is one of those things that can't wait any longer for us to actually move on. One of the things that we do at People for Bikes is think about how we are actually sort of approaching these problems. And we recently commissioned a nationwide study where we surveyed people across metro areas in the US, and we found out, stunningly, that people actually see bikes, public transit, other transportation alternatives as solutions to traffic problems. And so there's this deep-held sort of thought and sentiment that people don't want change to actually happen. And what we found in asking people about what do they value about transportation, how do they sort of perceive transportation to actually be, is that we fundamentally find that people acknowledge and recognize all of the benefits, all of the things that all the people here in this room talk about every single day. They recognize that walking or riding your bicycle is going to have a health benefit for you. They think that's amazing. It scores and ranks very highly in their list. They see that public transit helps get cars off the road. They see that carpooling services does the same. They recognize all of these tangible benefits that we are oftentimes communicating and messaging about, even if they're not going to actually use those any single day themselves. They recognize that there's value for other people. And so we ask ourselves, well, what's the holdup then? What's preventing us from actually moving it? If the general populace, this number for this statement is something like 75%. 75% of people that we talked to acknowledge that alternatives was a solution to bicycling. What's actually holding us up and preventing us from actually moving on? And what we're finding is that there's a strong movement within our cities to actually tackle this problem. How can we take this popular opinion that transportation alternatives, bicycling, walking, public transit, all of the new mobility devices coming online are a solution for our cities, but our cities just aren't built to move at the speed at which public sentiment's actually changing. We're actually spending a lot of our time now working in cities thinking about this concept of networks. Where I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, PeopleForBikes would have been very project-oriented, thinking about how do we build the right protected bicycle lane, how do we design this corridor in the right way, how do we sort of do data analysis in this single project. We're now thinking much more holistically about transportation, not just as the singular mode of transportation, and not just as a singular project, not as a singular moment in time, but how are we connecting all of these pieces together? How are we connecting infrastructure, the network of how people move around, but then also connecting the network of people in terms of both how they play into that process and how do they sort of utilize and use physical networks in their daily life. There's a couple of key sort of strategies here that sort of highlight and sort of summarize, how cities are looking at this. Modern mobility networks are moving quickly, right? It's about taking action. It's about taking that project that was 10 years in the making and maybe will break ground. I'm still not comfortable saying that it's going to break down. Taking that and moving the planning design process to construction to just a few months. Cities are finding a lot of value in working in smaller focus areas, doing lots of intensive work in a smaller area all at once. Again, thinking about this network, but thinking about the network in terms of the network of people. How are we bringing more people to the table? How are we involving more people and tying them into our work? And then, how are we being smart about our communications? How are we using things like polling and surveying, data collection, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding? Smart cities aren't just about the technology that we're installing. It's about how we're being smart about how we're talking about and communicating with people and messaging that work. Here's a quick example of a modern mobility network. This is Sevilla, Spain. This is an amazing place. Who in 2005, those little green squiggles on the screen, that was their bicycle network in 2005. A local there, Manuel Calvo, told me that some planner at some point in time talked about building a network in the early 2000s, and this was the result of building that network. He talked about, told a story that's all of us have experienced, all of us know, right? Planners go out to sort of talk about planning a bicycle network. They draw up a really nice plan. Engineers and then city leaders begin to move forward on executing that plan. You identify a corridor. That corridor gets mired in a discussion about moving one parking spot from one side of the street to the other. Years go by, public dialogue drags out. At the end of the day, you get little more than what looks like a spaghetti noodle thrown onto a map rather than an actual network. For the better part of 2 decades, Sevilla was growing into a very car-centric facility. You can see mode share almost doubled over that, for driving almost doubled over that time. Transit and walking saw huge declines, even in a city whose central city is sort of medieval. Driving around Sevilla cannot be a fun experience. It is the tiniest of streets in the world, and to know that the driving was going up so much during this period of time is almost unfathomable. There was a really interesting thing that happened, though, in the late 2000s. A new government, new leadership was elected in Sevilla. And they had a couple things that happened. One, they had a participatory budgeting process. This new government instilled a new level of democracy into how communities were going to be funded, how infrastructure was going to be built, and they allowed people in the city to suggest and then vote on how they wanted to see funding be spent. Two, they did some political polling to find out where people were with their priorities. So to accompany this budgetary process, they went out and did a survey of all the people living there, and they asked a very simple question: do you support expanding the bicycle network in Sevilla? And something like 85% of the people said yes. It's a pretty simple but pretty effective tool. And then they had some really new leadership within the city itself who were people who had the energy, the drive, the passion to transform the city. And so they set about building a bicycle network. And between the years of 2007 and 2010, they constructed 120 kilometers of a bicycle network throughout the city, almost all exclusively taking space away from cars. What's really interesting about this is that they held a central tenet that all of their work was going to be done on arterial roadways, taking away parking, taking away travel lanes, never stealing space away from pedestrians. This is what the typical sort of network looks like in Sevilla today: two-way cycle tracks at the sidewalk level, separated with some sort of physical barrier. And it crisscrosses the city, but gave people access to all of the places that they actually wanted to go. There's places here in the US that are drawing on this inspiration. I was just in New Orleans, and many of you probably were as well, in the fall for the Walk Bike Places conference. In the 30 days leading up to this conference, hundreds of volunteers in the city of New Orleans partnered for the Connect the Crescent project, where they went out in the span of 30 days for less than $100,000 with teams of volunteers and added 3.5–4 miles of new protected bicycle lanes in downtown, in essence creating the entire downtown network in bicycle lanes in just a month. It's amazing. Streets were completely transformed from what they were before. And it didn't cost the city a lot of money. It didn't cost local advocates there a lot of money. And they're still doing some of the data analysis right now, but there's a lot of really interesting results coming out of this. One of these being the direct relation to traffic crashes during this period of time versus before. It's a way in which cities are sort of thinking about moving quickly and adopting this network approach. I'd be remiss if I didn't do a little feature on my hometown in Memphis, who are taking these kinds of projects in a way that's a little bit different than New Orleans. Where New Orleans and sort of Sevilla were focused on the functionality of it, Memphis is using these kinds of projects as a way to build community trust, build community buy-in, and create that network of people, that network of advocates, that network of supporters that are helping to really move information along. These are a couple of street transformations that are part of public processes, now official part of citywide public processes, that go a long way in terms of helping demonstrate that the city is willing to move quickly, but continue to honor its engineering and planning roots in a way that continues to hold true. Here's Sevilla, Spain today. I think what's amazing about this is that they didn't rest on their laurels, and they've decided that they're going to double the size of their network over the next 3 years. They're already underway, and they're approaching sort of the end of that cycle. What you'll see there in the number of cycling trips every day is they sort of peaked at about 70,000 daily cycling trips in 2011, with a little dip. But what's interesting to note is that between 2011 and just 2016, that's a period of time in which Spain really felt the crunch of the international financial crisis. They actually elected a new government to come in and right the wrongs. They told me, and not to be too political about this, but they hired a conservative government to come in and help sort of fix the financial crisis. And the only thing the conservative government was good at doing was doing nothing. They largely didn't progress with any new projects during this time across the board, not just cycling. And they continue to sort of hold on to this level of mode share. I mentioned that smart cities aren't just about having smart technology, but it's about doing our jobs better and talking about what we're doing our jobs. I'm in the unique position a lot of times of reviewing technical resource requests from communities across the US. And I often find that a lot of the resource requests are very focused on telling our story, telling the story of what we're doing. There's a lot of sort of self-interest in trying to describe our process, to be transparent about the things that we're doing, but we're not actually connecting with people about things that they actually want to hear. And we've just commissioned a really interesting piece of research about what it actually takes to connect with people. How do we talk about changing our streets in a way that actually builds support for changing our streets and not just exposes what we actually want people to know about how we're changing their streets? It's about acknowledging that there's trade-offs exist. We have to do something different. Not everybody wins in terms of changing our streets, but it also ties into this notion that we all have a part to play and we all have a piece of the road. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ashley Hand, and I'm thrilled to be here today. Let's see if we can get there. So I am co-founder of a company called Cityfi. We focus on urban change management, there we go, which we really think about how do we get ready for the future? How do we prepare our cities for what's to come next? Let's see if I can get don't seem to be advancing. There we go. But prior to co-founding this company, I had a fellowship which brought me back into Los Angeles. It was the second time I'd lived there, but this time I was returning with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And I was invited by the Gold Hirsch Foundation and the Mayor's Fund of Los Angeles, a partnership to bring resources to the city to look at the future of mobility, to help address concerns that the 25 and 30-year plan was not going to touch. There was no mention of autonomous vehicles in the general plan, which was a big thing considering had just been adopted the month before I started my fellowship. But I brought a 2- and 4-year-old back into Los Angeles where I had been accustomed to living car light and very pedestrian-oriented life. But this time I had children that would dash out in front of me at intersections, that would touch absolutely everything, and suddenly were riding transit for the first time in their lives, having been born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri. They were now in an environment where they'd have an opportunity to interact with their community through transit. And as a mother, suddenly the idea of slogging a stroller around, bringing children around, totally changed the way that I saw mobility as I was entering into this fellowship. Now, our fascination with technology in cities spans a very long time. These two covers are 100 years apart. So it's nothing new that we're still having a conversation about what a smart city really could be and what the potential of it is. But the challenge is that the pace of change that we're seeing in technological innovation today is so much faster than how our cities adapt. The 10-year cycle for project plans is not unusual. We think much further ahead, we build infrastructure that lasts a lot longer, and frankly, we can't keep up with what's happening. And when we think about how our communities are changing, their preferences for the way they access services, the expectation for real-time alignment of needs to resources is completely changing the paradigm. But for every person that does have access to these services, we cannot forget that there are many people that are left behind by these technologies. So for all the folks that do have access to a smartphone, we can't forget the people that may have a smartphone but not have that data plan. They may have a smartphone but may not have a bank account that allows them to pay for these services. So it's really important that we balance the future of technology in our cities with a people-first approach. But I think quite remarkably, when we think about what these smartphones have done with all the other technologies in our built environment is create tons and tons of data. It's the one resource we have more of in our cities. And as a result of this new data, we have the ability to think differently about how we get this work done, new ways, new business models, new partnerships to explore the way that we can solve in our urban environment. But again, because things are happening very quickly, we have to reconcile the fact that things are going to be different. And there are unintended consequences. The taxi industry, for example, was caught on its heels when T&Cs were introduced, suddenly disrupting generations of regulation that had cities asking the question of how do we regulate what's new while leveling the playing field for what's already there. And we do have many priorities that we have to figure out how to integrate. And I think the challenges of safety, and we think about Vision Zero policies popping up all over the country in response to how deadly our streets are, is a really important consideration. So if we want to address the future of technology in a way that makes our streets safer and makes our cities more livable, we have to make sure that we take a more human-centered approach. And frankly, the introduction of autonomous vehicles, while really interesting in terms of the potential it has to improve access and mobility for many more people, make our roadways safer, it also potentially creates more congestion. If you think about zombie cars driving around doing your errands for you, more vehicle miles traveled is a major impact on our urban centers. So that's where urban mobility in a digital age emerged. This fellowship had me researching across the country and looking for best practices, but also thinking about how do we prepare the Department of Transportation and the city of Los Angeles as a whole, where you spend about 104 hours stuck in traffic every year, for this future of shared mobility and autonomous vehicles. Well, it was about starting with setting this kind of core vision of what we wanted in the future. So this was through policies and programs and the idea of piloting to get things done more quickly, because we need to be open to a little bit of risk when it comes to understanding the impact these technologies might have by allowing us the space to explore and understand how to manage them. So the strategy envisions the city as a platform, really thinking about pivoting from this idea that the city's role is to either provide a direct service through transit, which the city of LA provides the second largest transit network in the region of Los Angeles, second only to the county. And the other idea, which is we also provide the infrastructure with many different departments creating the built environment that we live within. But moving from that to the role of mobility manager, how do we provide oversight to an ecosystem of services that are provided by both the public and private, as well as community-based organizations, to really rethink what this ecosystem really is and how does it best serve our community? And ultimately, it's also about how do we bring more people to the table through the exchange of data, through new mobility as a service models, and ultimately thinking of our infrastructure as a service that we provide. So this strategy outlines a series of policies, urban design and planning guidelines, as well as a space for experimentation. Because more now than ever before, we have to be open to the fact that we don't really know who the technology winners are. So we must create a flexible environment that allows us to adapt and change. Because we know that scooters are here, but what's next? In Los Angeles, we're planning for aerial taxis. This is a whole new level of data analysis that we suddenly have to be understanding where our tree canopies are, because we have to now think, okay, this is going to be the next level of data about our infrastructure that will be valuable to this mobility network. So the transportation strategy really was not creating something new, but into building on the existing policies, whether it was a sustainability plan, mobility plan, or Vision Zero in Los Angeles. But defining what the future would look like and the desired future state that focuses on the outcomes the city wants, we now are able to clearly state who and how you can work with us. And ultimately, the plan really focuses on implementation, because it's one thing to put some good ideas out there, it's another thing to test them. So this envisioning the city as a platform, a flexible space for creativity and innovation, is a very different way than kind of the top-down approach that we often take. So it allows us to look at how do we build and understand the type of data that we need to operate in this new ecosystem? How do we leverage technology and design as a combination of services, because you have to plan for graceful failure. When does the technology not work? How does your city work? And then thinking about how do we create the feedback loops that we need to continue to innovate. One of the key recommendations that came out of the strategy was the idea of transportation happiness. So I mentioned my 2 daughters that would come and sit in the car and who would hate to travel that way because all they could do was see the back of our heads and not engage with us directly. But while riding transit, they had a community because they took a schedule every day to and from school. They had people that they knew that were regular riders. They had a mental map of their city that was so different than if you put them in the back of a car and drop them off at their destination, because now they could understand how to navigate and get through. So I was very excited when I was listening to Darcy, just because I think this is something that we can really think about. But the key to this is measurement. How do we establish a baseline today so we can understand how we get there in the future? Recognizing that the status quo doesn't work. 104 hours in traffic is a waste it has a major impact on our communities, public health, major impact on our economy, as well as on our environment. That is not Los Angeles, that's China. Just feels like that in LA. But I think it's important to recognize that we have to go beyond just appealing to kind of the greater good, the willingness of people to want to transform. You know, we talk a lot about the social benefits of different transportation modes, but we really need to think about a way that helps us kind of compare and that people can understand, and then we can use as we plan for infrastructure and service improvements. And ultimately, this gets down to that personal gut check that I had as someone who was a mom trying to get around Los Angeles, thinking about how commuting itself is something that we spend a lot of time doing, but doesn't necessarily add much to our day. And in fact, most studies show that driving alone is one of the most stressful ways of commuting. And we spend an awful lot of time doing that. 75 minutes a day is spent stressing ourselves out, which has a major public health impact. Meanwhile, we happen to know that there are huge benefits to other modes that are more active. And the study that was done in the UK showed that overall risk factors like heart disease and things like that went down among commuter populations that relied on active transportation, particularly cycling, to get around. So why not build a network that has a lot of other benefits to our community? But in order to really understand user experience, you have to get in the shoes of the user. And so what we wanted to do is start to figure out, why does this matter? Because it really does affect us in different ways. And I think, you see this every year. There's a survey of what's the worst bus stops in the nation. And frankly, when you look at the communities that rely on transit to get around, we have to think about the quality of experience is an equity issue as well. And we can do so much more to improve that user experience that doesn't have anything to do with technology. Sometimes it's as simple as a street tree with shade. So when we think about how we can address the changing needs of our community, as we have aging in place populations, as we think about how the public right-of-way could be better prioritized to serve more users, not just the automobile, and think about how we can start to have a conversation that is data-driven, that is no longer driven by the conversation of, we have 15 council districts, and so every slice of the pie has to be divided up by 15 every single time. But we can start to allocate the resources we need in a much more tactical way to address what's actually happening in our city streets. So whether you subscribe to Maslow's hierarchy or not, the idea is that you need to provide a quality service for people to choose you. We see that with the instant gratification of transportation network companies. I know who's coming to pick me up, I know when they're gonna get there, I know how long it's gonna take me to get where I wanna go, I know how much it's going to cost, and I know the rating of the driver that's getting me there. That type of transparency transformed your comfort level when it came to my willingness to get into the car with a complete stranger, which where I grew up, when I was growing up, you did not do. So this type of idea that if we can start to shed some light on the quality of experience that you might expect, I think it's a very big catalyst for changing behavior. So introducing transportation happiness. The way that we started was to outline the Mobility Bill of Rights. We wanted to outline some key tenets to help understand what we were going to commit to as the Department of Transportation in the city of LA. Accessibility and reliability are obviously key gateways. If you cannot get access to it and you cannot depend on it, you will likely not use it if you can afford to do something else. But also we wanted to think about the physical comfort and the sense of safety that you may have, whether it's actual or perceived. So it's quantitative and qualitative to understand that you can get around and feel free from harm. Connecting to community is another key principle. We thought it was really essential to highlight the fact that your transportation happiness will be linked directly to your sense of place. And equity and transparency is really about your voice in the process around decision making. This is LADOT's commitment to ensure that you have a stake at the table when it comes to changes that are happening in your mobility network. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but the idea, and it's all available on the website, urbanmobilityla.com, but we start to outline the KPIs. And key to this is really understanding that we have a lot of this data already. So it's just about understanding and measuring it on a regular basis. So thinking about those street tree assets, thinking about where park benches are, thinking about what services you have, and the processes you use to get feedback from your community all become part of it. Important to consider is that this is not just for one mode. This is across all modes, and hopefully preparing us for the future of new modes, which we can't quite imagine, but they're coming. And it's understanding that when we start to pilot, you don't have to do it all at once. It takes time to build a culture around data, but that you should start to build off of what you have. And in this case, in Los Angeles, focusing on taxis and transit, which are heavily regulated with tons of data already, we could start there. And you need to think creatively about what types of data you have, because we don't always collect a lot of qualitative data. We have a lot of quantitative and transactional data in government, but we have partnerships and advocates that are collecting information through surveys. We have a lot of tools by creating data sharing agreements with third-party providers that suddenly can give you that information and now make it easier for you to see this full ecosystem. But we also have programs like Safe Routes to School and 311 that allow us to collect a lot of information about condition data to help move us forward. This is nothing new. This was something that came up as a concept in 1987 in Los Angeles. Didn't change a lot because it wasn't really actionable, but by being data-driven, we hope that transportation happiness will start to improve. So I think our future should look a little bit more like this. And frankly, because the technology our winners are unclear, we have to design a better future that is focused on people first. And if we can do that in a data-driven way with the flexibility and the kind of change management approach that we're starting to outline and see in cities across the country, we will be in a better position to address that. Thank you very much.
Wow, super hard acts to follow this morning. As Carlos said, my name is Paul Steely-White, and I am a veteran of the New York City bike lane wars. Lived to tell about it. It seems like such a short time ago that a gentleman by the name of Anthony Weiner was running for mayor of New York. Did Anthony Weiner, news of Anthony, make it down to Florida? Yeah. So my biggest sort of distinction in New York is that once upon a time, Anthony Weiner called me a policy jihadist for suggesting that we design streets that don't kill people. Luckily, he didn't win the mayoralty. But, you know, what we did in New York is, of course, it was amazing, and I was so lucky to be a part of it and work with Jeanette Sadiq-Khan and make things happen. You know, I moved to New York in 1997 from Missoula, Montana, because I saw this picture of these activists, right? Big change. Culture shock. I'm still dealing with that, actually. People using their bodies, their bicycles, even houseplants to block the loop drive in Central Park, to say this is people's space, it should be car-free. And that campaign was started in the 60s, in the late 60s. So to talk about how long it takes to get some of this stuff done, this past summer, before joining Bird, when I was still at Transportation Alternatives, I had the honor of driving a 1966 Mustang convertible through Central Park as the last car ever in Central Park. I had to get a driver's license for the occasion. But it was really an honor, and really, so to make the transition from Bird, it was kind of obvious that maybe it was time to sort of try some new challenges. What's the advance? The big one. So, Bird just came into being less than 2 years ago, right? And we've been part of this big revolution. I think 2018, was the year that shared e-scooters kind of came to the world. Between us and our competitors, there have been tens of millions of e-scooter trips, shared e-scooter trips in the United States alone. They're here to stay. I think the question is, how do we make them work better? How do we make them safer? I have really 4 main messages for you today, takeaways, if you will. One is that the research out there that's being done indicates that shared e-scooters are as safe as bicycles on average. It varies a little bit from city to city, but that's what we're seeing, and I'll share some of that data in a moment. Second, we can make it safer, and shared e-scooters can actually make streets safer for everyone. And I'll explain that partly through their ability to replace car trips, which is happening to a great extent. I'll share some of that. And then third and finally, just a bit about the politics. Some of you are advocates, maybe most of you are practitioners, work for government. But I think to the points that were made, if we're going to be successful, we all have to be advocates. We all have to deal with the politics. But I think the politics are changing in our favor because the data is getting better and because more people are frankly understanding what we have to do, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So in New York City, we get it done a number of ways. We work a lot with data and research and the media and getting our message out there, of course, but really it comes down to organizing people and getting people to hassle their elected officials. I mean, really, that's kind of what it boils down to. But we've been very successful in organizing not just people who walk, people who ride bikes, now people who want to ride e-scooters, but New Yorkers who've lost loved ones in traffic crashes. And many of you know the story of Families for Safe Streets. There's now chapters that are burgeoning around the country. But it's a life and death issue. Sustainability is obviously becoming so much more important. But the lever that works the best is just to show people that fewer people are killed and injured when you design streets in a modern, inclusive way. And so these family members are literally holding hands together on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan to make a protected bike lane where there wasn't one. And that project is happening. When I mentioned a moment ago that one of the takeaways I wanted you to come away with was that scooters are as safe as bicycles, I heard some chuckles. And I understand that skepticism. I read the newspapers too. In Portland, this past fall, there were a bunch of newspaper stories similar to this, worse than this. You see the takeaway here. An official says, these 25 injuries are just the tip of the iceberg. There's something inherently dangerous about shared e-scooters, right? And this has been in the media all over the place. And then last month, there was actually a pretty exhaustive report from the Portland Bureau of Transportation. You should check it out online. Really a lot of information in there. With the main finding that there's nothing disproportionately dangerous about e-scooters. We found no disproportionate risk was their final conclusion. They also found that e-scooters could make streets safer for everyone to the extent that they're replacing car trips. In Portland, that number was 34% of people on scooters, on shared e-scooters, were taking trips that would have otherwise been taken by car. So that's private car, Uber, Lyft. And because we know that traffic injuries and fatalities are linked most closely to VMT and driving, and indirectly by the design of streets, thank you, Darcy, there's really a demonstrable safety impact there the more that we can demonstrate that. You may have also heard, there's a study recently from the UCLA Medical Center where they looked at injury and ER admissions for Westwood and Santa Monica. And you can see there the 3 bars there. The red are the scooter injuries they saw, and the blue is the bike. So they had a few more scooter injuries than bike injuries. It was a matter of a few dozen or a few score difference. And that was the takeaway that people got, right? That scooters are more dangerous than bikes. When you dig into the data that the report didn't actually, we're in touch with these researchers now. There were millions of trips, millions of shared e-scooter trips in Westwood and Santa Monica. And of those 240 injuries, 15 of them required an overnight hospital stay, and only 2 were deemed severe. So that severe injury rate of 2 over millions of trips between us and our competitors actually puts us right in line with bicycling. So, I think there are more, I don't think, we can say definitively there are more shared e-scooter injuries today than there were 2 years ago, right? But the context is all important. Now, how can we make it safer? How can we make shared e-scooters safer? This is this shows when we operate at Bird. We don't operate in the early morning hours. And that's a decision that we made early on, recognizing that crash risk goes up overnight. Fatigue, low visibility, intoxication, right? And so after about 50 or 60 million shared e-scooter trips in the United States in the past year and a half, there have been 4 fatalities. Now again, that fatality rate is actually a bit better than bicycling. There's about one bike fatality for every 12.5 million bike miles traveled. So the industry is doing a little bit better, but we can do much better because of those 4 fatalities we've seen, 3 of them have occurred at like 3 a.m., 4 a.m. So I think the industry, as we evolve, we need to work with cities to nail some really smart operational parameters like time of day, like age restrictions, right? If you talk to anyone in the ER or epidemiology world who've been watching private scooters, private motorized scooters, kick scooters, they'll tell you it's a pediatric phenomenon. Kids are more often injured on these than adults. And so that's another operational responsibility we have as an industry to keep kids off our scooters. So at Bird, we require proof of age to make sure that's the case. So I think we can continue to lead in how we are executing. Many of you know this, I hope all of you know this, but it's worth pointing out. Scooters can pose a nuisance to pedestrians if they're not parked properly, if they're operating irresponsibly. We're doing a better job of requiring our riders, not just telling them, but actually proving that they're parking properly. We have bird watchers who are full-time. They go out there, they move the scooters to where they need to go. There's a lot more we can and must do, but scooters are not killing people, despite some of the headlines that you see. It's like with bicycling. Every 3 or 4 years you might see an incident, but by and large, we're not injuring or killing pedestrians. And it's just the physics that are involved. We're not going fast. It's a lightweight vehicle. Cars and trucks killed 6,000 Americans last year. But the headlines we're seeing are all about scooters, So again, I think it's important to keep this in context. This is the big takeaway. So this is actually what has me really excited, and you should be excited too. And I think we're seeing a similar number in Coral Gables with our limited fleet there. But I want to say it and say it as loudly as I can. Shared e-scooters are replacing car trips, okay? This is a big question. Are scooters just going to replace walking trips or biking trips? Where's that travel really coming from? In city after city, we are now seeing, on average, about 30% of shared e-scooter trips are trips that would have otherwise been taken by a car. That is a major, major finding. And there's so many implications there for the climate, for street space, right? Replacing all those car trips make it much easier to reclaim that space. It makes it much more likely that someone on an e-scooter is also just a regular person, and that's in fact the number that we're seeing, is that compared to bicycling, e-scooter riders are much more like you and me. They're just, maybe not me being a white guy who loves to wear spandex, but the general population. About 60% of shared e-scooter riders in Portland had never used the bike share system. 40% had never been on a bike before, right? So this is a phenomenon. We're seeing massive uptake. We're seeing mass appeal. This is a big solution, folks. Again, the Portland study, big numbers. 6% of people said they were giving up their car because the e-scooter option was now available to them. And this is, by the way, after 700,000 trips in Portland over 4 months. And again, that top line finding that there's no disproportionate risk. Now, people want bike lanes. We know that's the case. Our internal surveys say that. As has been noted, there's a perceived safety benefit. There's a real safety benefit. In New York City, we are killing 100 fewer people on our streets than we were 4 years ago because of Vision Zero. And that has to do really with street design. That's where the data tells us is that's what's working. And so where this is going, safety in numbers, better streets, safer lanes, more ridership, And this is why scooters are going to make a difference, right? Because that political power of all of these regular folks who are now on the streets feeling vulnerable, just like bikers have forever, and now they want to get involved with their local bike traffic safety advocacy group. They want to hassle their elected officials too. So we can all figure out how to tap into this wave of people who are now on board with accelerating the pace of change on our streets. I want to end, I'm going to zip through this safety in numbers. Safety in numbers is real. The more people bike, walk, scoot, the safer it is for everyone. Roughly, this is research by Peter Jacobson at UC Davis. Every time you triple the number of ambient vulnerable road users out there, you're halving the crash rate. And that's partly because motorists become more in tune with seeing. There's sort of this habituation that happens, this visual habituation. It's also because that person who's walking, biking, or scooting, or I should say that person who's driving, is also someone who may occasionally walk, bike, or scoot. So they're seeing it from their point of view. In Tel Aviv, 10% of city residents have ridden a bird scooter. And that sounds like I'm just like boasting about the company that I'm proud to work for. But it's actually pretty amazing that 10% of people in a city have ridden just one of our scooters, not to mention our competition. So they are seeing the streets from that point of view. I want to end with a photo here. Who knows who that guy is in the top hat? I'll be very impressed. I only learned of him recently, maybe some of you engineers out there. I was in London a couple weeks ago, and this photo got a round of applause because that is Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who followed on the work of Dr. John Snow, who did the first cholera maps of London, proving that cholera isn't something that you get because you're dirty or because you're Irish or because you're unlucky or because you happen to live in a city. No, it's something you got because our city infrastructure was not safe. And when that research was used to overhaul London's water and sewage systems, there were a little bit of politics at first. Oh my gosh, you're going to completely disrupt our lives. You're going to build this massively expensive system. And then they said, yeah, but you know what? We're going to make cholera a thing of the past. And so this is where it's going. The data on not just protected bike lanes, but traffic calming, pedestrian refuge islands, lower urban speed limits, it's getting so robust that this is becoming less political. It's becoming depoliticized. It will always be political, of course, but I think it will be easier because we're not talking about something that's nice to have. We're talking about vital safety engineering. And so I'll leave you with this photo because Dr. John Snow and Bazalgette, I think, showed the way for all of us that traffic crashes like cholera are completely preventable. And until that day happens when we've changed the culture so that this is science and not opinion, we can count on the growing hordes of scooter riders to help us turn the tide. Thank you very much.
What an excellent panel we have here today. We have time for one question, and I think we heard today from people from bikes, people from everything, right? People actually moving people. We talk about happiness and everything about infrastructure to make sure that we don't have to wear that superhero suit, right? That Iron Man suit, a place that we can walk around. And what we can do, not only engineers, but people from our community. And the question that we have here with the most votes that we have, and I encourage you guys to continue to use Slido for the next panels, is coming from an elected official. He said, what can we do? What can we do to encourage and request for more bicycle facilities, for scooters, for people in our community, for those short trips that are within cars today? What can we do to advocate for those in infrastructure that is not ours, for either county, state, or someone else that comes within our municipalities? What can we do?
Well, I think one thing that I focused on a lot is capacity building. I think it's really important, first of all, to empower your local staff to be more data-driven, to be able to have a good data-driven conversation with other agencies. It becomes a really powerful tool to get out of the politics of decision-making and really be able to show evidence. So I think that's one thing that I would say is invest in your people first. Secondly, I think the reality is that we have a lot more at our capacity in terms of who are the stakeholders. And I think we need to think very broadly about who to bring to the table in conversations with those agencies. We have well-organized advocacy groups, but we also have community-based organizations. In Los Angeles, what we've started to do is to bring more community organizations into new service design conversations before car sharing services get launched in a neighborhood, for example. And by bringing those other voices to the table, the private sector, the private mobility providers, and others to the table earlier in those conversations, you can be much more effective in having some change at that level.
I think Paul mentioned this, right? But a lot of this work is really just about building movements to support the change that we actually want to see. And there's a lot of our work at PeopleForBikes is about helping cities, helping communities and governments overcome the barriers that prevent them from moving very quickly. And obviously, sort of jurisdictional responsibility, who pays for it, that all plays into this. And there's on one hand, there's a group of cities that are just saying, who cares who's responsible for it? Let's just make the change happen. That comes up a lot of times, particularly when there's a safety issue, someone is killed. We're able to sort of overlook whatever jurisdictional responsibilities. But there's a real lack of urgency, I think, between agencies, between municipalities, that allow some of these projects just to linger. And a lot of this work is about building the momentum that creates that sense of urgency. Now that can lead to a couple of different strategies, right? A community could do all of the projects around this particular corridor or this intersection in a way that makes it stand out, that shames agencies into standing up and taking action. But I think maybe more importantly is sort of like my slide near the end that talks about how we talk to people, right? Mm-hmm. Great messaging isn't about communicating what we want. If I want an intersection to be fixed, I can't just tell you I want the intersection to be fixed. Great messaging is about communicating what people want to hear, but consistent with what I actually need and what I want to do. And so, what we want to talk about in terms of sort of cooperative agreements is like meeting people where they actually are, being able to acknowledge that there's going to be some give and go, there's going to be some transactional sort of nature of this business, but about talking about things in a different way that brings more people to the table.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I would say probably just take what you learned here today and tell everyone you know, and let's make sure we have more people that you need to change their minds, come to these type of summits moving forward. Please join me in a welcome. Round of applause for these guys. It's been great. Thank you.